A headline, The Wall Street Journal, 1932. The radium water worked fine until his jaw came off. That's not a tabloid, that's the Wall Street Journal. And his name was Eben Byers, the Yale man, national golf champion, Pittsburgh industrialist, one of the most socially connected men in America. He didn't just stumble into this. He didn't buy something off the street corner. A doctor prescribed it. He drank 1,400 bottles. By the end, his jaw was surgically removed. Holes were forming in his skull. He weighed 90 pounds. When they tested his bones after he died, they glowed on photographic film. They lined his coffin with lead. And here's what they didn't put in his obituary. The government already had the evidence, in writing, in medical journals, in their own reports. They knew this before he took the first bottle. So the question isn't what killed Eben Byers. The question is, who let it happen? I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. This is the story of the false miracle cures promised by radium water. Before it killed anyone, radium was magic. Not metaphorically, literally. It glowed in the dark. You could hold a vial of it in a pitch-black room and watch it pulse with pale blue light. Scientists couldn't fully explain it. The public couldn't get enough of it. Marie Curie discovered it in 1898. Within a decade, it was everywhere. Radium toothpaste, radium chocolate, radium face cream, radium suppositories. Ouch! I'm not making that up. The logic was simple. Radium glows, glowing means energy, energy means life, so if you consume enough of it, you would glow too. That was the sales pitch, and it worked. Radium clinics opened across the country, pharmacies stocked radium water, newspapers ran advertisements, public figures endorsed it. This wasn't underground medicine. This wasn't back alley snake oil. It sold to the educated, the wealthy, the people who read scientific journals and trusted men in white coats. It was marketed as science. And at the same exact moment that wealthy Americans were drinking radium water for their health, factories across New Jersey and Illinois, young women were painting watch dials with radium-laced paint. They were told to lick the brush to keep a fine tip hundreds of times a day. Now, their supervisors knew what radium did. The laboratory workers at those same facilities wore lead aprons. They used ivory tip tongs to handle the material. They stood behind protective barriers. The women painting the dials got nothing. And by the early 1920s, the teeth were loosening, jawbones were softening, wounds wouldn't heal, bones simply crumbled away. They called it radium jaw. Medical papers were published, government bulletins were issued, the U.S. Department of Labor documented it. By the mid-1920s, the dial painters were in the newspapers. Their lawsuits were in the courts. The science wasn't a secret. And in 1927, right in the middle of it all, a man named William Bailey was shipping a product called Radithor to customers across the United States. 2 ounces per bottle, radium dissolved in distilled water. The label said, and I'm reading it directly, certified radioactive water, harmless in every respect. And one of his best customers was about to become the most famous radium victim in American history. William J.A. Bailey wasn't a physician. He had no accredited medical degree, but he understood something far more important in the 1920s, authority. He presented himself as Dr. Bailey and built a laboratory. He used scientific language and precision instruments. Each bottle of Radithor was labeled as containing 1 microcurie of radium and 1 microcurie of mesothorium. These are exact quantities. They're measured, calculated, scientific, made the product sound controlled, engineered, safe. Bailey didn't sell mystery. He sold dosage and laboratory credibility. And here's what's critical. Radithor wasn't a patent medicine in the traditional sense. It was distilled water with dissolved radioactive material, nothing more. This means the effect people felt was from the radiation itself. There was no masking ingredient like a sedative or narcotic, just radioactive decay inside the body, and people thought it was healthy. Bailey priced it at $1 a bottle. Now, that's around the cost of a high-end medical visit at the time. It wasn't meant for the poor. The product was aimed at the affluent, the educated, and Bailey did something else. He avoided direct medical claims that would immediately trigger legal action. So instead of saying cure, he used language like treatment, revitalizer, invigorator. It was ambiguous enough terms to slip through the existing regulation. Now, at this point in American history, the Food and Drug Act of 1906 existed, but enforcement was limited. Advertising was tightly controlled, and radioactive substances weren't yet comprehensively regulated. Meanwhile, in medical literature, there was already documented cases of radium accumulating in bone. Researchers observed something alarming. Radium behaves chemically like calcium. The body mistakes it for calcium and deposits it inside the bone tissue. Once embedded there, it doesn't leave. That wasn't theoretical. It's a fact documented in studies involving industrial exposure, which means that by the late 1920s, the mechanism was understood. Radium lodges in the skeleton and irradiates it from the inside. Bailey either knew this or didn't care because Radithor continued to ship. It continued to sell and people continued to use it. And one of the most loyal customers was about to become impossible to ignore. Eben Byers was the kind of man who filled a room. Yale graduate, industrialist, United States amateur golf champion in 1906. He was wealthy, charming, well-connected, the kind of man who got invited everywhere and accepted only half the invitations because he didn't need the other half. In 1927, he was on a train returning from the Harvard-Yale football game. He fell from his berth and injured his arm. Nothing catastrophic. It's the kind of injury a man like Byers would expect to shake off in a week, but he didn't shake it off. His Pittsburgh physician, Dr. C.C. Moyer, recommended something for the pain, something for the recovery, something that was, at that moment, being prescribed by doctors across the country for wealthy patients who expected the best of everything. Radithor, 2 ounces at a time, taken like a tonic. Bailey's instructions suggested up to 3 bottles a day. Byers felt better almost immediately. And here's where it gets complicated because he wasn't faking it. Radium exposure in small doses produces a temporary stimulant effect. You get increased energy, a sense of well-being, and warmth in the body. Byers felt it and believed in it completely. He wrote letters to Bailey personally, called Radithor the finest thing he'd ever encountered. He told his friends and even sent cases as gifts. He fed it to his horses. And there was a woman, a female friend he introduced to Radithor, personally recommended it, sent her bottles. She died of radium poisoning. But Byers kept drinking. By the time he stopped, he consumed nearly 1,400 bottles. That's roughly 73 micrograms of radium deposited directly into his skeleton. The body doesn't announce that kind of damage all at once. It accumulates quietly inside the bone, inside the marrow. The radiation working continuously in the skeleton where no one can see it and nothing can stop it. And then, slowly, it starts to show. Teeth loosening, weight dropping, energy collapsing. The man who'd been vigorous and athletic and socially dominant was becoming unrecognizable. By 1930, the jaw pain started. By 1931, he could barely leave his Southampton mansion. Now that year, the Federal Trade Commission sent an attorney to take his testimony. His name was Robert Heiner Wynn. Wynn handled FTC cases before. He interviewed witnesses in offices and courtrooms and conference rooms, and he'd never seen anything like what he walked into at that Southampton estate. He wrote about it afterwards, and his description in the official government document is one of the most haunting things I've ever read in a primary source. He wrote, "A more gruesome experience in a more gorgeous setting would be hard to imagine." Think about what that sentence means. A mansion with every creature comfort, every luxury, and inside it, a man literally dissolving. 4 months later, surgeons removed part of his jaw. The bone was dead, necrotic. It wouldn't heal and it wouldn't regenerate. By March 1932, Eben Byers weighed 90 pounds and his skull had holes in it. He died on March 31st. The autopsy was methodical, clinical. It was the kind of document that strips all sentiment away and just records the facts. Necrosis of the jaw, brain abscess, secondary anemia, terminal bronchopneumonia, and then the number that makes all of it real, 73 micrograms of radium, locked inside his skeleton, measured bone by bone, femur, vertebrae, rib, jaw, teeth. His bones were placed against photographic film. They exposed the film themselves. His skeleton was radioactive enough to take its own photograph. Let me show you a timeline. 1913, British scientist Walter Lazarus Barlow publishes research documenting that ingested radium goes directly into the bone. It's not a theory, a documented finding, published and peer-reviewed in a scientific record. 1914, the University of Maryland reviews 700 medical reports on radium exposure. 700 cases. The findings include bone necrosis as a frequent documented side effect. In the early 1920s, dial painters in New Jersey began losing their teeth. Their jawbones began dissolving. Company doctors tell them that it's syphilis. Right. 1925, the Radium Girls are in the newspapers. Their lawsuits are in the courts. The mechanism is understood. Radium mimics calcium. The body pulls it into the skeleton. It irradiates from the inside. This isn't theoretical anymore. This is happening to real women in real courtrooms in real time. 1925, settlements are reached. The science is in the legal record now, not just the medical journals. It's in courts. And the U.S. Public Health Service, the federal government's own public health apparatus, issued warnings about radium ingestion. Now, Eben Byers took his first bottle of Radithor in 1927. Now, remember, right in the middle of that, 1913, research existed. 1914, review existed. The dial painters existed. Lawsuits existed, and the government warnings existed. And Radithor was still on the market. It was shipping to customers. It was recommended by physicians collecting their 17% commission. Here's the detail I keep coming back to. The workers handling radium in those facilities, the laboratory technicians, the researchers, they wore lead aprons. They used ivory-tipped tongs to move material. They stood behind protective barriers. The women painting the dials got nothing. The men drinking it for their health got a brochure telling them that it was harmless in every respect. So WTF? Why didn't someone stop it? Here's the uncomfortable answer. The Federal Trade Commission had authority over false and misleading advertising. Not over poison, and not over bodily harm, just advertising. The Food and Drug Act of 1906 existed, but radium wasn't classified as a food or a drug. It existed as a regulatory gap. It's a blind spot written directly into the law, which meant that the FTC could only move against Bailey if they could prove his claims were false, not if they could prove his product was killing people. Think about what that means. The government needed a courtroom argument about words on a label while men were drinking radioactive water and women were dying of jaw necrosis. The law could chase the language, it couldn't chase the damage. And even when the FTC finally opened a form of proceeding against Bailey Radium Laboratories, the cease-and-desist order came December 19, 1931. Eben Byers had already testified, already lost his jaw. He was already dying in his Southampton mansion. The government's own document records it. One witness consumed approximately 1,300 bottles. At the time of the testimony, he had pronounced necrosis of the jaw. His physician testified it was radium poisoning. And then, Bailey Radium Laboratories asked to withdraw its answer. In plain English, they stopped fighting. So no formal findings of fact, no detailed ruling. Most importantly, no criminal prosecution. Just a signed order telling them to stop using certain words in their advertising. Nothing more. And here's the thing about William Bailey that the cease and desist order doesn't tell you. He kept working. He renamed products and restructured companies. He stayed in the radium business and died in 1949 of bladder cancer. 20 years later, researchers exhumed his body. His remains were described as ravaged by radiation and still hot. Let me tell you about Dr. C.C. Moyer. He was the Pittsburgh physician who prescribed Radithor to Eben Byers in 1927, the man who handed a national golf champion a bottle of radioactive water and told him to drink it. Now, after Byers died, after the autopsy, after the photographic plates, and after the 73 micrograms of radium were measured bone by bone out of his skeleton, Dr. Moyer gave a statement to the press. He said Radithor didn't kill Eben Byers. He said he himself consumed just as much, and he, in his words, was perfectly healthy at 51. The man who prescribed 1,400 bottles of radioactive water to a patient who died of radiation poisoning was telling reporters he felt fine. Put a pin in that for a moment because it tells you everything about how this era worked. Not the science or the regulation, the psychology. People who built their credibility on this product couldn't afford to believe what the autopsy said, so they didn't. Now let me tell you about the women that nobody remembers. The Radium Girls were factory workers. Young women, most of them immigrants or daughters of immigrants, working class. They painted watch dials in New Jersey and Illinois for wages that felt decent in 1917, but kind of looked criminal in hindsight. They were told the paint was harmless. They licked the brush to keep the tip fine, sometimes hundreds of times a day. Some of them painted their nails with it, their faces. They joked about glowing in the dark on the way home. And by the early 1920s, they were dying. Their lawsuits took years. The companies fought every one. Corporate doctors filed reports blaming syphilis, blaming poor hygiene, blaming the women themselves. The settlements, when they finally came, were quiet and small. The companies never formally admitted what they'd done. The suffering was documented. It was peer-reviewed and published in courts and papers, and Radithor stayed on the market. Now, Byers got sick, the Yale golf champion, friend of politicians, fixture in the community. His jaw was surgically removed, and suddenly people were paying attention. The New York Times ran it on the front page, April 1st, 1932. Eben Byers dies of radium poisoning. Criminal inquiry begun. Criminal inquiry, front page. Notice it didn't make the papers when the dial painters were dying or when the medical literature was published. Not even when the government's own public health service issued warnings. The shiz hit the fan only when a millionaire's jaw fell off. Now that wasn't an accident. It's not coincidence, it's reality, the way the system was built. Working class women dying in factories was an industrial problem, something to be managed, litigated quietly, and settled cheaply. A wealthy man dissolving away in his Southampton mansion, now that was a scandal. And a scandal in 1932 moved governments. The FTC cease and desist against Bailey came in December of 1931. That's 4 months before Byers died. But the investigation opened because of Byers, because of who he was, because of the attention his illness attracted in circles where attention produced consequences. The dial painters, they'd been dying for a decade. It took him. And here's the final cruelty of the story. Even after all of it, after the front page, the lead-lined coffin, after Bailey's own body was found still hot 2 decades later, the sweeping overhaul of federal food and drug law didn't come until 1938. That's 6 years after Byers died. 6 years in which radium was still known to embed in bone, still known to cause necrosis and be fatal internally, and the legal structure was still catching up. Which raises the last question, the one this entire episode has been building towards. If the pattern is clear, warning, denial, proof case, reform, how many times does it have to repeat before the reform comes first? After Byers was buried, after the headlines faded and the FTC filed its paperwork and the radium water disappeared from the pharmacy shelves, William Bailey kept working. He restructured. He rebranded and moved through the radium business like a man believed the rules didn't apply to him, because for most of his career, they didn't. He died in 1949 from bladder cancer, remember? His family buried him and the world moved on. 20 years passed. In the late 60s, researchers studying the long-term effects of radium exposure decided that they needed to know something. They needed to know what radium actually did to the body of a man who'd spent decades working with it, selling it, claiming it was harmless in every respect. So they got a court order and they exhumed William Bailey. What they found, after 2 decades in the ground, his remains were described as ravaged by radiation and still hot. The man who told the world radium was safe, who built a business on that claim, who collected his 17% commissions while his customers dissolved, was still radioactive in his coffin. Let me bring you back to the FBI documents we looked at earlier in this episode, because this story has a modern echo. 1999, St. Charles County, Missouri, a man named Ricky McCormick is found dead in a field. He's badly decomposed. Evidence suggests that he's killed somewhere else and left there. In his pants pockets, 2 handwritten notes, dense, layered, encrypted in a system no one has ever seen before or since. The FBI spent years on those notes. 2 separate rounds of cryptoanalysis, their own laboratory, their own experts. In 2010, they published their conclusion. All attempts to decipher the symbols were unsuccessful. Now, I'm telling you about Ricky McCormick because of what connects his story to Eben Byers. Not radium or poisoning, it's the official record. In both cases, the government's own documents tell you more than the official narrative. The FTC file tells you that Bailey was paying doctors to prescribe poison. The autopsy tells you that the government's own scientists measured the damage and published it. The FBI laboratory report tells you McCormick had a wound to the neck, that he wasn't killed where he was found, that his notes were sophisticated enough to defeat the most advanced cryptoanalysis unit in the world. The records exist. Most people never look at them. That's what this channel does. We go into the official record, the government's documents, the laboratory reports, the FTC filings, the autopsy findings, and we read what is actually there. Not the version that gets sanitized for the history books or the papers, the documents themselves. Eben Byers didn't die because radium was mysterious. He died because the people who knew exactly what it did kept selling it anyway. And the system designed to stop them was designed to move slowly. His skeleton contained 73 micrograms of radium. Now that number was calculated in a laboratory. It was written in a medical journal, entered into the permanent record. The title of this episode was never sensational. It was always literal. His jaw fell off. The government already knew. If this episode made you want to go look up documents yourself, you can find them by visiting the FBI vault at vault.fbi.gov. The National Archives are at archives.gov. The FTC records are public. The autopsy data is published. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.